All right, welcome. We have a panel of the great ones who need no introduction and shall have no introduction. We'll begin with Lucrezia, and the plan is for everyone to speak for 10 minutes and then have another round for 5 minutes each and then 15 minutes for general discussion. And the theme of this panel, which was conceived early last fall, before inflation was all over the place, was that inflation will be all over the place. So let's talk about it. And well, here we are. Hopefully we're going to have a nice discussion on whether inflation this time is different from what we are used to and what we have learned from the recent episodes in terms of macroeconomics and where research and policy needs to be headed now. Lucrezia.
Thank you, and thank you for showing up, because I think after 2 days of this fantastic conference, I feel a little bit of fatigue, but anyway, so the topic is very important, and also because I think that probably most of you in this room have never lived with inflation. I'm old enough to remember it, but I think that you probably, you don't even know what it is, right? Except for maybe people coming from Russia. So, until recently, we mostly worried about undershooting the inflation target. And, today we are overshooting, and, there is a question of what to do about it, but also how to understand the mechanism. So let me just first spend 1 minute on the undershooting, because it's still very recently. So what is it that research understood for that period, the undershooting period? I think there are certain things that we clearly understood. For example, we understood that an increase in the monetary base is not necessarily inflationary. I think that's a very important message for policymakers. And I think this is really, something that research contributed to the debate. This is, to the extent that demand of reserves is satiated, then the extra reserves have no effect on inflation because they have no effect on liquidity premia. That's an important message. Again, I say that this is an important message because ex ante, that was not obvious. A lot of policymakers were worrying about, quantitative easing and expansion of balance sheet producing inflation. What about undershooting, however, in that period? There are many competing explanations. Global imported low inflation, death of the Phillips curve, ineffective monetary policy at the zero lower bound, the bad combination of monetary and fiscal policy, and so on. I think that if we look at the euro area and the US, I'm going to give you my view for these 10 minutes. I think that we can make the case that the undershooting was really related to policy mistakes during the debt crisis. And there is now quite a lot of empirical evidence showing that point. And this actually, I think there is an important topic for research because it points also to the interaction between monetary policy, fiscal policy, and financial markets. I think you talked about in the previous panel the issues, and in the euro area, the adjustment, it's an element of the adjustment when things happen is flight to safety. We don't have a safe asset, so that means that the spreads go, they start widening. Suddenly, and this impairs the effect of monetary policy, and I think there is empirical evidence about that. Now, however, some puzzles remain, especially for the US, and I think that these puzzles are mostly due to the fact that we understand very little about expectation formation. And, I will say a little bit something later on. Now, what about now? So now we are in the overshooting regime. Now, and we are also facing the type of shocks which are quite difficult to understand because they are reallocation, that's COVID, relative price shocks. And, the question is how average inflation adjusts to those shocks and then how policy should behave. Now, if we compare the US with the euro area, there is a standard explanation. This has been, basically discussed in other panels, in these 2 days. But the facts are that, even if policies were quite different across the two sides of the Atlantic, at this point we have a quite similar headline. And actually, the inflation in the euro area is even higher. However, it has to be said that if we look at expectation, which is the key variable to look at, expectations in the US started moving up, before the war and, at a much earlier stage and by a larger magnitude. So in the euro area, they just started moving a little bit now, and also core inflation moved less in the euro area. So the common explanation for the US is that fiscal policy was too generous, and so that and monetary policy was late in the tightening cycle. Now, in terms of what research has to say about that, because I think this is the focus of this panel, I think that influential research at the beginning of the pandemic suggested that using fiscal policy was the right thing to do. And the argument was that facing COVID shocks, monetary policy expansion would have created misallocation, while fiscal transfers would have helped to reach the so-called efficient equilibrium. And so this is actually interesting research because it points to the fact that monetary policy has actually two functions: a reallocation function and also an aggregate demand oil in the wheel function. Now, so it is possible then that the combination of fiscal and monetary policy in the U.S. was wrong. So monetary policy was excessively easy, given the fact that there was this big fiscal stimulus. So if you do fiscal transfers, that has this kind of reallocation positive effect. But then you should not do expansion of demand with monetary policy because that will lead to excessive demand. And okay, so that's one possible explanation. But another possible explanation is that actually it was fiscal expansion that was excessive, especially in the second package that was implemented. And then it went beyond what was needed to secure reallocation. So, but this points to the fact that actually it is very hard to discuss about inflation today without looking at the interaction between monetary and fiscal policy. So I think that that's one lesson. Now, what happened in the euro area? Now, the supply explanation was very persuasive until very recently. I think it's especially because expectation moved very little. What about now? Clearly, the energy shock has hit the euro area very hard. We know that in the euro area we are both, we are not producers. In the US, at least they are producers. They are consumers, but they are producers, while we're not producers, so that the energy shock hits everybody. But the key question, I think there are two questions. So clearly we are facing a very nasty trade-off between output and inflation, and there are two key questions. One is, do energy shocks feed expectations? Now here there is research, partly research by Yuri Godrichenko, a little bit of empirical research also with me and my co-author, that point to the fact that energies feed expectation via channels which are different from what the standard model suggests. So the standard model says energy markup Phillips curve. But there is evidence that there is this kind of expectationally driven component of energy dynamics that can affect headline in quite non-standard ways. So this is something that definitely we should worry about. And the second question is how policymakers should face costly trade-off between output and inflation in a situation in which there is no divine coincidence. Remember that, a while ago, this is what we taught our students. Now, so on the second question, there is a big issues on how to deal with secondary objectives, okay, because we are now in a flexible targeting situation. We have a new operational framework with many instruments, new strategy which gives us flexibility to central banks on the horizon at which they should reach the inflation objective, and costly trade-offs. So the way, so I think that it's very difficult to answer to these questions, but clearly this is a test of the new operational frameworks, both at the ECB and at the Fed. Now, one idea that in the recent CEPR report on monetary policy we put on the table, and this is mostly related to research by Klaus Adam, is that actually if there are costly trade-offs, for example, between inflation and output gap, so where the output gap is the secondary objective, then we should, to the extent that there are costs in implementing the instruments, we should have a longer horizon at which we reach the target, okay? So that the horizon of the flexible inflation targeting framework should be linked to the cost of the instruments. Now, of course, I mean, this is nice in a little model, but, again, expectations are key. And so all this research about beliefs, expectation, information, and also combination monetary and fiscal policy and wage formation and so on is obviously very important here. So this is really an area where there should be more work. Now, going forward, and here I conclude, we should expect more reallocation type of shocks related to energy, dysfunctional energy markets, but also climate change. So all these issues about how to combine the reallocation functions and the pure aggregate demand functions in models with heterogeneous sectors, in which sectors are hit in a heterogeneous way, I think it's a very important line of research that brings us a little bit beyond the standard model. So I think that this is important. And of course, here the question is whether tolerating high inflation for a while or for too long hamper the reallocation process or actually facilitate reallocation process. This is the question. So ultimately, this is an empirical question. So to conclude, research has a lot to do in this area. This is very good for macroeconomists, but it's quite bad for policymakers. So
excellent.
That's it.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is going to be Luc, who has 2 slides somewhere here.
Yeah, thanks, Refet. It's really great to see so many friends. It has been probably, I guess, 3 years that I haven't seen most of you in person. And I remember back then we were all lamenting about having hit the zero lower bound and how do we get this number up from 1.8 to 2%, and we're scratching our head over that. And boy, times have changed since then in so many ways, but also in this inflation number. And I'm not so sure if it's making life for central bankers easier, but definitely more fun, because we don't have to convince the public that what we do is actually interesting and exciting. So with that, the homework I got from Refet, I've sort of broken up in 3 parts. First, I'll try to say a few words on similarities and differences with the 1970s, although I was born in the early 70s, so this is based on textbook analysis and the research out there, and I highly recommend the book by Ben Bernanke's book that just came out, and I struggled to get a copy last week, but I did get one. That was part of the homework, and I'm sure Gian-Maria will go into more detail on that because Ben is his colleague. So, but I will touch probably the most, in my view, important difference there. And the second I'll talk about is what are sort of lessons from monetary policy today, and then the third, as a researcher, of course, what are sort of important implications for macro research. So in the 70s, both in the 70s and today, these inflation bursts were preceded by large-scale fiscal stimulus. Differences are back then related to war efforts in Vietnam. And of course, also another similarity is these oil price shocks we've talked about. Now, I think important difference is that on top of that, today we have these supply bottlenecks, supply chain disruptions. And I think it's also fair to say that's one of the lessons, I think, for policymakers. We sort of underestimated the severity, and in particular, I would say the duration of these supply bottlenecks. Basically, in a world where you have some big countries applying zero COVID policy, as long as they do that and you don't get immunity, we will basically be living with these type of disruptions for much longer than we hoped for. Now, I think the silver lining here is, I remember when COVID broke out, the top epidemiologists, by the way, they all have much more consensus than we as a profession, but they were all telling me, you know, just brace yourself and for a tough ride here, because we're not going to get a vaccine in the coming decade. So I think the good thing here is it could have been much worse. But yes, this is a series of supply shocks. So in that sense, broadly speaking, it's sort of the same as yesteryear. Now, I think an important difference is the way we apply policy to these supply shocks. So we learned from the 70s that we can sort of mostly look through them, not basically ignore them like the Fed governors did back then. They had sort of a very different theory in mind, focusing very much on employment, plus, of course, being very much under the whim of the US president and Congress, much more so than now. Now we have central bank independence. But I think much more important is that we've sort of moved away from focusing on current inflation and output dynamics to focusing on inflation expectations. And so the mantra at central banks since then has been, as long as these inflation expectations are well anchored, you can by and large look through these supply shocks. And I think this is what central banks have done so far. And as Lucrezia, I think, very clearly explained, at the moment, these inflation expectations are drifting up. They have been drifting up for a while already in the US, and they're starting now in Europe. And this then, of course, creates this really nasty trade-off that we're facing. Now, I think in terms of lessons for monetary policy, I would say it is one should distinguish between sort of a series of small supply shocks and the large ones we have observed so far. I think there's a real discontinuity there. Any of these manual cost models that we use to get our head around price setting and all that, it just comes out of these models. Like a restaurant is going to change the prices on the menus when it's subject to very large energy or other supply shocks, and wouldn't do so if these are very small. And so in terms of relative price adjustment that we're basically going to need, it matters a great deal if you're subject to these very large positive price movements, and you cannot expect similarly large price declines in other parts of your basket. So this is definitely going to push up the price level, and that's sort of what we are, I believe, seeing right now. And then I think another important lesson for monetary policy today is that back in the 70s, one thing was much easier. The financial system was much simpler, much smaller, so you could sort of ignore it with just a bunch of banks. Right now, coming from very low interest rates, there may be some financial stability risks associated with the hike in interest rates that the Fed has already been embarking on, and that the ECB has basically announced that will be coming this summer. Now, those are short-term volatilities that I don't worry too much about, but you never know, because I think there was a nice panel yesterday where basically the financial stability experts on the panel were telling us that we basically don't have much of a clue of the risk in this whole non-banking shadow, whatever part of the system. So there could be something. This depends very much on the path of interest rate that will be chosen and how quickly this is done. Now, I would say, by and large, I'm of the view that raising interest rates is going to be good for financial stability, definitely over the medium run, in the sense that, it can't have it both ways, right? For 10 years we've been saying that there was this search for yield from all these horrible low interest rates over the medium run, and it can't be bad now again over the medium run. So I think we sort of go in the other direction now, which is sort of actually a good thing. But there could be in the short run some hiccups, especially if it feeds into sovereign spreads, for instance. Now, and then the lesson for macro, I don't think I need this slide, Refet. It's basically that it's all about heterogeneity, I think, now, in terms of what the exciting research, not just on inflation, but in general on macro. And basically, I would say there's sort of two important lines of research. One is better understanding of the formation of expectations. I agree with Lucrezia that it doesn't work really the way it's in the models, at least if you look at also at microdata. So the ECB, we are investing heavily in this type of research. We are doing consumer expectation surveys, and indeed Yuri is very much involved in that kind of work with us. We have a very large network on price setting, behavior, collecting micro price data. And out of all of this, indeed, comes first and foremost that substitution within the basket really matters. It's not just changes in prices, but consumers also switch goods, and that matters, has some macro implications. And then on the inflation expectations, for instance, right now, the latest survey results shows that the mass of the distribution of consumers that believes that inflation over the medium run is going to be between 3% and 4% suddenly jumped up since March. And, you know, whether, so the median hasn't shifted, the mean is shifting up a lot. So I think a big question for us is, how important are these tills? How important are these distributions? So you see a lot in the macro data, there's a lot of exciting models being built, incorporating heterogeneity, Hank, etc. So far, I don't think we have consensus as to whether all of that is macro relevant. But I think we need to give it more of a shot than what we're doing now, because I think that's an area where we can make enormous progress, because I think the rest we're sort of a little bit stuck. And so I'm not convinced yet that it's all macro relevant, but I'm investing most of our resources into that area of research because I think it's the most promising. So I'll leave it at that for the intro. Thanks.
Super. Gian Maria.
So I'm also absolutely delighted to be able to see so many friends in person after 2 years, and I think Beatrice, CEPR have done an amazing job at putting this conference together. It's the first time that...
Gian Maria, can you speak a bit closer to the microphone and
Sure.
a bit louder? Yeah.
Let me try with this one. It is the first time really that I've been sitting 9 to 6, 7 in a conference with so much concentration despite jet lag and everything else. So it's really kudos to CEPR, wonderful event. I want to start with a consideration that I felt has received a bit too little attention in some of the presentations, which is the massive uncertainty under which policymakers were operating during this period. We are sort of compressing a bit what has happened since the beginning of the pandemic into, what recent past. But you had a meltdown in global financial markets in March of 2020. Then a year later, we were worrying about asset price bubbles. But in March of 2020, the situation was a risk of a massive global financial meltdown. And I think policymakers reacted extremely rapidly, very appropriately overall, and really that the lessons from the global financial crisis were learned. I stress the uncertainty because, again, a lot of the work we are doing takes a bit of a deterministic approach in which you had a bunch of policy actions and resulting almost mechanically in a bunch of outcomes. And then we say, well, maybe we should have tailored the policy action a little bit differently. But I think there are a lot of nonlinearities in all this. And again, one thing is the policy response of March 2020 was facing a very different set of conditions, and one thing is assessing the third fiscal package that the US did under Biden at the beginning of his administration. So there are various phases in this. I think, ex post, we need to draw lessons. Brookings has a wonderful volume that they did on every aspect of the US policy response, an assessment ex post from the support to firms, to the checks to households, to forbearance on mortgage debt, something that I think every single country should really be doing. So I wanted to get that out first, because I think it colors also the criticism that, talk more about the US, that I'll make of the way in which the policy response ended up being undertaken, especially in the more recent period. So what we have seen is, in response to this massive support, is a very strong recovery in domestic demand. And this is despite the fact that the pandemic has turned out to be much worse than what our scenarios in April, May 2020 were foreshadowing. You had repeated waves and all that. So despite all this, domestic demand has been growing much more rapidly. And here is where the differences across countries come into play, and I think that where the differences in the inflation phenomenon become important. So very strong recovery in domestic demand, very unbalanced between goods and services. So the optimistic forecasts were at the beginning of the pandemic, were forecasts that assumed the pandemic would somehow go away. And so if you had a recovery, it would be a more balanced recovery. The pandemic did not go away. We had a very unbalanced recovery, heavily skewed towards goods. To give you an example, in the US, consumption of consumer durables as of the second quarter of 2021 was 29% higher than in the fourth quarter of 2019. And that's just a stunning number. Of course, services are a bigger share of GDP. Services consumption were down. But when you think about supply chain issues, when you think about what has happened to commodity prices, one has to be careful in saying, oh, of course, with domestic demand recovering, you would see a boom in commodity prices. Say, well, hold on a second. What type of domestic demand recovery did we see? So the boom in commodity prices is clearly linked not just to the strength of demand, but to the fact that demand has been very heavily skewed towards goods. And again, I think it was not hard to think that there would be a shift in demand towards goods, but hard to think you could have such a strong recovery in demand with services still lagging. Now, everybody agrees that the Fed, with the benefit of hindsight, was late in reacting. But let's see a little bit what the situation was, say, mid-2021. What was the Fed facing? Unemployment around 6%. 7 million jobs short the US economy of the level of employment before COVID. 7 million. And that's without accounting for what trend growth in employment ought to be. So the overall assessment was there is a lot of slack in the labor market, a lot of slack. Now, what happened ex post was a combination of two things. First, rapid employment growth, of course, during the second half of the year, but also the realization that you had labor supply issues that were much more persistent than anybody had really expected. As a result, the assessment of the labor market turned out to be behind the curve. Not because US inflation has been triggered by wage pressures, but because in a forward-looking sense, the concern that mostly a goods price-driven inflation also, with an important global component in it, would, lead to a wage price spiral became much more salient with the realization that the labor market was much tighter than anybody expected. On top of this, we realized, again, monetary policy supports activity, but it tends in particular to support interest-sensitive sectors. Now, it turns out that interest-sensitive sectors are primarily housing and consumer durables. And those are sectors that normally get hammered in a recession. But this, again, was a most unusual recession. And those sectors were sectors that had been benefiting from a shift in relative demand already. And in this sense, monetary policy may have contributed to further stimulating sectors which may not have needed as much support. So Fed behind the curve, the issue is they're catching up. What are the prospects for inflation to be brought under control? Again, I see the US in this regard as a very different spot relative to Europe, with clear signs of excess demand. By the way, domestic demand in the US compared to the euro area, the difference between where domestic demand was at the end of 2021 is about 6 percentage points. So US demand was 5% above pre-COVID levels, and euro area domestic demand, excluding Ireland, was 1% below. So it's a massive difference in the strength of domestic demand. Where are things going? I think, again, uncertainty. I think the realization of inflation will crucially depend on what happens to commodity prices and to bottlenecks on supply chains, enormously more than what happens on the monetary policy front over this end-of-year horizon. Now, of course, we worry about whether monetary policy will keep expectations anchored, so I'm not discounting the importance of the policy reaction, but a big concern is going to be whether what is envisaged will be sufficient to bring domestic demand under, slow down domestic demand sufficiently in the US. I think a lot of the concerns relate to the fact that the forecasts of the Fed have unemployment hovering at record low levels and inflation coming down very, very sharply. I think inflation will come down as goods prices come down. We also are going to have a rebalancing of demand towards services. We are already seeing it. Some of the excesses that I stressed, for example, in the demand for durable goods are reverting. All the more so given the relative price shocks. But clearly bringing things under control will not be easy, and the Fed may face a situation where inflation is down considerably relative to now, but is not close to 2. And then we'll have to decide whether, with slowing domestic demand, they're going to be willing to tighten further to bring inflation further down at the cost of higher unemployment. Let me leave it at this. I probably already went over time, and happy to take questions at the end. Thank you.
So we'll do one more round quickly. Let me throw in the idea that in the world that Gian Maria envisions, where inflation is down, but not to 2%, but the American economy might be slowing on its own volition or by the Fed's action, it's going to have massive implications for the long rates too. And that's something that a generation of traders haven't seen, and that's going to be ugly. Let's go back to Lucrezia on further thoughts and reflections on the comments of Luc and Gian Maria for about 5 minutes.
Well, I don't know. So it's possible. I see that Gian Maria is extremely, optimistic about what's going to happen. And, frankly, I have nothing to add because maybe. I think I think that, frankly, I don't know what to say because, yes, it's a conjecture, and it's, my view on this, based on my own empirical analysis. I've seen the expectations from the US side going up already in 2021, while this was not happening in the euro area. So I think that this is telling us something. I mean, and the uncertainty was in both sides of the Atlantic. And clearly there is a difference in policy. And exposed, we can say, I think, that a combination between monetary and fiscal policy in the US was not appropriate. So I think this is the only thing that we can see from the data. Then, maybe it's too early to, to close this debate, but I think there is something to learn from that difference. So, so from what you said, I mean, you focus on the US, but I think if you compare it with the euro area, you could see that, this difference in expectation is a reflection of the combination of policies. So until the war, I was quite confident that the euro area had done the right thing. Okay, so that, now, there are new challenges, but. And on Luc, I think the issues of financial stability, it's important, and this actually is one of the things I said about the transmission mechanism in the euro area is complicated by the fact that you are facing the risk of balkanization and segmentation whenever there is risk. And this is actually an empirical result of a recent Voss column of mine that the effect of interest rate policies when there is this heterogeneity in the long-term sovereign rates impair the transmission. And this is now recent results which are compatible with earlier research that was done during the debt crisis.
So I think Gian Maria mentioned a few times that maybe some central banks have been or are behind the curve. I won't comment on the Fed, but I think there's something intrinsic in the way central banks behave and looking at basically sacrifice ratios that gets them to react often in a more exposed way, which is not necessarily a bad thing. And it's also asymmetric in the following sense that when all major central banks reacted very aggressively with accommodative monetary policy following COVID shocks, they were all welcomed as heroes, and it was seen as acting super fast. But again, it was exposed. They had not foreseen that shock. And I think I'm sort of with Gian Maria. I mean, unfortunately, we're still in this world where it's highly uncertain. It's maybe even more uncertain because on top of COVID now, we really don't know what's going on in Putin's mind, how long this war will be going on. And unfortunately, most of my Russian friends tell me that this will be very protracted because we haven't done the full way of the sanctions. So to me, the asymmetry comes that, so it's really difficult, especially, I would say, for the Fed with their dual mandate, if you're so much focused on the labor market, it's very, very costly to move on interest rates before you see a sharp drifting away in inflation expectations. That's the reality. That's going from science to practice of central banking. And so at least I can only speak for the ECB. So the ECB, I think, is definitely, that's the number we are focusing on. That's the only thing we talk about, and we apply some medium-term perspective to that, call it 3 years or whatever. And you should ask Philip what he applies. But, and indeed, there the numbers have been looking good. But what I said is now, at least in some of the surveys, including the ones we're running ourselves, we see the mass of the distribution that responds with numbers above 2%. And okay, you have to take away all the noise around it because half these people don't know what is inflation or what is a percentage. But I look at changes in these responses and I see the mass going to 3 to 4%, suddenly drifting up. And that's definitely not being ignored. This is what wakes us up. But we sort of have to wait until we see that because otherwise we're going to kill off this, still not as rather fragile recovery, right, that we've been seeing.
But can I say something now? I woke up
please.
Because, So the ECB has a problem also of sequence of policy tightening, okay? So, and I think that this is, it's a new thing that, I mean, it gives us flexibility, but also add complexity because we have more instruments. So, I mean, I think it's hard to justify negative interest rate at this juncture. I think
Yeah, I was going to get to
okay,
that.
but on the other hand, there is the question, so what to do with asset purchases, given the fragmentation that we both, emphasize.
Yes.
So, and I think on that, the ECB was not that clear about how they're going to. And I think, given what all of us said, I mean, it seems to me that there should be a tightening on the short-term interest rate side, but also perhaps another instruments to address the issue of segmentation. And the good thing is that we have experience now because we have done it in COVID, so we can do it now as well.
So I was going to get to that. Thanks for that, Lucrezia, because indeed we've all been waiting for a change in the course and in the communication. So indeed, it was now communicated that basically the marginal instrument of choice is going to be interest rate movements. It's no longer these balance sheet policies. It doesn't mean these balance sheet policies, we just forget about them and they just sit there. So the moment the ECB will announce the interest rate path, it will be, there will be also, of course, communication around balance sheet policy. But you're absolutely right that is a little bit more complicated in the euro area than in the US, where these balance sheet policies have that fragmentation aspect to them. Now, I would say another complication for central banks is that, at least from the models coming out of a zero-low bound world, most of our models will tell us we need to now hike interest rates rather fast, steep, like at least early on, and then be very clear at least about the path. So not, next quarter we do that, and maybe the quarter after that or whatever. That's really hard to commit to for central banks as well, for the same trade-offs that we talked about. I think that's where I see the biggest risk for central banks at the current juncture. And then I think for the euro area, on top of that, yes, there's the advantage of looking overseas at what the Fed is doing and learning from their successes and mistakes. But we are very much also dependent on what they do. So if they do make a mistake, basically if they're behind the curve, which I'm not saying they are, but then that complicates matters a little bit. Buy some time, but we basically import those.
Just to clarify on whether I'm optimistic or not, I'm much more worried about the ability of the US to bring inflation down to in an immaculate fashion without engineering somehow a pretty drastic slowdown of economic activity. So on the inflation front, I think clearly signs of excess demand in the US. You see it on the current account, you see it in global demand, demand for goods, you see it everywhere. I'm much less worried about the risk of persistent inflation in the euro area compared to the US. I think also the energy, you had same inflation headline, but of course you had a much bigger energy shock because of gas prices, which are important here and are not important in the US. So I don't think I'm optimistic. I've been trying to sketch why, in a sense, how I think policy decisions were taken, where the assessment mistakes were made, and I think again, in judging ex post is always much easier. And again, we don't know. We've had a lot of inflation pressure coming from goods prices. There is now more services inflation. You do have a lot of pent-up demand in services, as anybody that has tried to book a flight knows. We're going to have to, again, assess how much of this pent-up demand leads to is a spike that eventually reverts to a more normal trend. And also, again, as you rebalance what happens to demand for goods and hence to the pressures that we have seen over the past few years. So my worries about the euro area are there, but they are less about inflation being unanchored and more about what happens to economic activity, about the risk of fragmentations, all the things that Lucrezia have talked about.
But in the U.S., in the euro area, as you said, we are facing a much, substantial energy shock.
Yeah, indeed.
And so in there, these issues of how this transmits to expectations is key. And so I think that we are now facing a much harder problem than the U.S. And that problem is going to persist because the war is going to persist, and the dysfunctionality in energy markets is going to persist. So, I think that we Europeans are in a very bad spot right now, even if, until a few months ago, the narrative was quite consistent with the fact that we had a better policy mix. But now I think the situation is quite different.
Yeah, no, I agree it is different. This being a panel on inflation, I sort of stated my views on what the risk of unanchoring inflation expectations is on one side versus the other of the Atlantic. I'm not arguing that the policy choices are easier in Europe. I think, again, you have much more risks to activity, which is obviously a huge deal. But, I mean, I look at the degree of tightness of the labor market, which is, in a forward-looking sense, the key thing we worry about in terms of where you could start an inflation process that persists over time. And I think there are massive differences between the two sides of the Atlantic still on that front. And you see it in wage growth in Europe.
All right. Thank you.